Deep in the shadow-carved valleys of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to mountain peaks like ancient secrets, certain family names were never spoken above a whisper. Not out of respect, but out of pure, bone-deep terror. These weren't just backwoods clans struggling to survive in America's forgotten hollows. These were dynasties built on blood, fear, and violence so brutal that even today, local historians refuse to document their full stories. When federal marshals received orders to investigate these families, many simply resigned rather than venture into territories where the law meant nothing and bullets settled every dispute. Between 1860 and 1950, 9 families carved out criminal empires in the Appalachian wilderness, creating kingdoms of terror that operated beyond the reach of civilization. Their stories were deliberately buried, their crimes covered up, their victims forgotten. But the mountains remember everything. And today, I, Agent Thomas Blackwood, am uncovering the blood-soaked legacies of families so dangerous that their very existence challenges everything we thought we knew about justice in America. What you're about to discover isn't taught in any history class. These are the true stories of America's most deadly mountain dynasties. Families whose names still make old-timers in Appalachian towns lock their doors when the sun goes down. The Blackwood clan, though no relation to my own name, stands as perhaps the most infamous of all Appalachian criminal families, though most people only know half their story. Led by the towering figure of Silas Stoneheart Blackwood, this clan didn't just engage in simple feuds. They operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise that controlled logging operations, mineral rights, and critical transport routes across 3 states. What started as disputes over disputed land quickly escalated into something far more sinister. Stoneheart Silas Blackwood was a Civil War veteran who returned home with an unnerving understanding of the land itself and a complete disregard for civilian law. He assembled his family into what functioned as a private army, complete with designated roles, strategic planning, and coordinated attacks. The Blackwoods controlled narrow mountain passes and river crossings along the Tug Fork, effectively taxing anyone who wanted to transport goods through their territory. Those who refused to pay found their wagons mysteriously overturned, their cargo scattered by what seemed like sudden, localized rock slides, and sometimes their bodies swept downstream by flash floods that appeared without warning on clear days. The family's signature method of intimidation involved what they called the Blackwood Cairn. After eliminating enemies, they would leave behind a stack of impossibly balanced stones, sometimes a single, oddly shaped rock placed precisely at the site of the incident. This psychological warfare proved incredibly effective, as entire communities would abandon their homes rather than risk becoming targets. Local sheriffs learned to recognize these cairns and often refused to investigate crimes in Blackwood territory. But the true extent of their brutality became clear during the winter of 1888. The Blackwoods didn't just attack rival logging camps in a fit of rage. They had spent weeks planning the assault, studying the camp's routines, identifying escape routes, and positioning their men at strategic points around the property. When they finally struck, they didn't use conventional weapons. Instead, they orchestrated a sudden, localized blizzard, then triggered a series of controlled avalanches and ice slides that buried the camps and methodically crushed anyone attempting to flee. What made this attack particularly horrifying was its calculated, almost natural nature. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated execution designed to send a message to anyone who dared oppose Blackwood authority. The aftermath revealed the true scope of their criminal network. Investigation into the incident uncovered evidence of bribery involving local officials, connections to timber syndicates in major cities, and financial records showing the family's annual income exceeded that of most legitimate businesses in the region. Stoneheart Silas had transformed what appeared to be a backwoods family into a multi-state criminal enterprise worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Even more disturbing were the family's recruitment methods. The Blackwoods didn't limit their organization to blood relatives. They systematically recruited young men from impoverished families, offering them steady income in exchange for absolute loyalty. These recruits underwent what amounted to wilderness tactical training, learning advanced survival techniques, how to read the most subtle shifts in weather patterns, and methods of manipulating natural occurrences. Those who proved themselves were eventually inducted into the inner circle through a ritual that local folklore claims involved spending a night alone in a remote, active rockslide area, emerging only if the mountain itself accepted them. The Blackwoods' influence extended far beyond their mountain stronghold. They maintained remote lodges in cities like Knoxville and Charlotte, allowing them to conduct business transactions and launder money from their various illegal enterprises. Federal investigators later discovered that Stoneheart Silas had established relationships with corrupt officials in multiple state governments, effectively purchasing protection from prosecution. What finally brought down the Blackwood organization wasn't law enforcement, but internal betrayal. As Stoneheart Silas aged, disputes arose among his sons over succession. The family split into competing factions, each claiming legitimate leadership. This internal warfare proved more destructive than any external threat they had faced. By 1891, the organization had effectively destroyed itself through fratricidal violence, leaving their land scarred and their methods adopted by lesser opportunists. The Vance Syndicate, often portrayed as helpless mountain farmers in historical accounts, were far from it. Under the leadership of Silas, Whisper Vance, they operated their own criminal network that rivaled the Blackwoods in both scope and brutality. What most people don't realize is that the infamous feuds weren't really about family honor or stolen livestock. It was a turf war between two organized crime families fighting for control of lucrative information pathways and illegal gambling operations. Whisper Vance had learned the art of information control from his father, who had been running an illicit courier service since before the Civil War. By the 1870s, the Vance operation had grown into a sophisticated distribution network that supplied rumors, secrets, and intelligence to corrupt officials and rival gangs throughout Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio. They used a complex system of hidden trails, secret codes, and trusted couriers, often seemingly innocent peddlers or isolated churchgoers, to move their product while avoiding federal authorities. The Vance's primary advantage over their rivals lay in their unparalleled intelligence network. They had infiltrated local law enforcement agencies, placing family members and loyal associates in positions where they could provide advanced warning of raids and investigations. Sheriff's Deputy Jed Vance, Silas's cousin, regularly passed along information about planned law enforcement operations, allowing the family to relocate their caches and hide evidence before authorities arrived. But the Vances' true specialty was elimination of competition. They didn't engage in direct confrontation like the Blackwoods preferred. Instead, they used more subtle, insidious methods. Rival information networks would suffer mysterious leaks that destroyed their credibility and operations. Competing messengers would disappear during routine trips, their bodies never recovered, but their last known conversations or notes would resurface, twisting truths and sowing mistrust. Revenue agents who proved too persistent in their investigations would find themselves transferred to distant assignments after receiving anonymous, yet deeply personal, threats against their families. The Vance organization also pioneered what law enforcement would later recognize as psychological warfare tactics through information control. Small-scale gossip peddlers in their territory were required to pay a percentage of their profits to the Vance family in exchange for protection from being exposed or discredited. Those who refused often found their reputations sabotaged, their words twisted, and their lives threatened by manufactured public outrage. What made the Vances particularly dangerous was their ability to manipulate public perception. While the Blackwoods ruled through overt fear and natural intimidation, the Vances cultivated an image of themselves as righteous mountain folk, defending their traditional way of life against outside interference. They portrayed their criminal activities as resistance to unfair government taxation and regulation, gaining sympathy from local populations who resented federal authority. This propaganda campaign proved remarkably effective. Even after evidence of their criminal activities became undeniable, many locals continued to view the Vances as folk heroes rather than criminals. This public support provided them with a steady stream of recruits and safe houses throughout the region. The Vance family's downfall came not from their war with the Blackwoods, but from their own success. As their operation grew larger and more profitable, it attracted attention from federal authorities who were beginning to crack down on organized crime. The creation of specialized intelligence units, specifically trained to combat information networks, made their traditional methods of avoiding detection increasingly ineffective. The final blow came when one of their most trusted lieutenants, facing federal charges that would have resulted in decades in prison, agreed to testify against the family in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the full extent of the Vance criminal empire, including detailed records of misinformation campaigns, evidence of multiple disappearances linked to information suppression, and documentation of their sophisticated network of informants and fabricated narratives moving deeper into Appalachian darkness. We encounter the Ash clan families of eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia. These mysterious people, with their pale skin, distinctive almost translucent eyes, and unsettling stillness, became the subject of wild speculation and darker fears. But the truth about certain Ash clans was far more disturbing than any folklore. The core Ash families, particularly the Sallow, Gray, and Moss lineages, had indeed been living in the mountains since before official European settlement. Their isolation wasn't entirely voluntary. These families possessed knowledge and practices that made even hardened mountain folk uncomfortable. They understood the mountains in ways that seemed supernatural to outsiders, navigating treacherous terrain without maps, predicting weather changes with uncanny accuracy, and finding game when experienced hunters returned empty-handed. But it was their understanding of human senses that made them truly dangerous. The Ash clans had developed sophisticated methods of sensory manipulation that they used to control territory and eliminate threats. They would study their enemies for months, learning their fears, weaknesses, and aversions. Then they would orchestrate elaborate campaigns of terror designed to drive opponents to madness or suicide through subtle environmental alteration. Their signature method involved what they called deepening the air. Ash operatives would position themselves around an enemy's home after dark, releasing invisible spores and subtle gases that caused respiratory distress and profound disorientation. These weren't random compounds, but carefully cultivated biological attacks designed to prevent sleep and induce profound paranoia. Victims would report hearing whispers that felt like they were inside their minds, seeing shadow figures from their peripheral vision, and experiencing a metallic taste in the air accompanied by an inexplicable, heavy stillness that pressed down on them. The Ash clans also practiced a form of biospiritual warfare that wouldn't be understood until the development of modern neurotoxicology. They cultivated specific fungi and plant compounds that produced hallucinogenic and neurotoxic effects, then introduced these substances into their enemies' food and water supplies, or even just allowed them to drift on the wind through open windows. Victims would experience terrifying hallucinations, develop mysterious illnesses, and sometimes die from conditions that local doctors couldn't diagnose or treat, often exhibiting extreme terror or catatonia in their final moments. What made the Ash clans particularly feared was their apparent ability to operate as a collective, almost hive-mind intelligence. Information spread through their communities with impossible speed, allowing them to coordinate activities across vast distances without any visible communication network. Travelers through Ash territory reported feeling constantly watched, as if the mountains themselves were alive and hostile, and that the very air was a medium through which they were observed. Federal investigators who attempted to study Ash communities in the early 1900s encountered unprecedented resistance. Documents would disappear from locked offices. Photographs would be found destroyed in developing chemicals. Researchers would suffer mysterious accidents that forced them to abandon their work. Several investigators reported experiencing shared nightmares featuring identical imagery of underground chambers and ritualistic ceremonies that left them profoundly disturbed. The most disturbing aspect of Ash clan culture was their treatment of outsiders who discovered too much about their activities. Rather than simply killing intruders, they would subject them to elaborate sensory and psychological torture designed to destroy their credibility and sanity. Victims would be released after weeks or months of captivity, but they would return to civilization with fragmented memories, severe sensory processing issues, and claims so bizarre that authorities dismissed them as mentally ill, often institutionalizing them. The Ash clan families began to disperse in the mid-1900s as modern communication and transportation systems made their traditional isolation impossible to maintain. Many integrated into mainstream society, hiding their heritage and abandoning their ancestral practices. But some families retreated deeper into the mountains, establishing hidden communities that continue to exist beyond the reach of modern authorities. They're deepening the air, techniques rumored to still manifest in unexplained pockets of malaise and shadow sightings. The Ironwood Collective of Eastern Kentucky represents perhaps the most militaristic of all Appalachian criminal families. Unlike other mountain outlaws who adapted existing criminal methods to their environment, the Ironwoods developed entirely new forms of guerrilla warfare specifically designed for the mountainous terrain of their territory, turning the very land into a weapon. The family's criminal enterprise began during Reconstruction when former Confederate soldiers, particularly engineers and demolition experts, found themselves excluded from legitimate economic opportunities. Led by Elias Forge Ironwood, a brutal tactician and decorated Civil War veteran, the family initially engaged in typical post-war banditry. But Forge possessed a tactical and environmental knowledge that transformed simple robbery into sophisticated military operations, making their territory impassable for outsiders. The Ironwoods established what amounted to a private military compound in the most remote section of Floyd County. Their property was surrounded by elaborate defensive fortifications, including trenches, bunkers, and concealed firing positions that could withstand assault by conventional law enforcement. The family maintained an arsenal that included military-grade weapons acquired through theft and black market purchases. What set the Ironwoods apart was their systematic approach to territorial control, focusing on making their land undesirable and deadly to outsiders. They divided their territory into operational zones, each with designated patrol routes, communication systems using elaborate flag signals and smoke patterns, and emergency protocols. Family members underwent regular military-style training that included marksmanship, explosives handling, and survival techniques tailored to endure extreme conditions. They maintained detailed maps showing the locations of law enforcement facilities, transportation routes, and potential escape paths, always with an eye to how the land itself could be manipulated. The Ironwood's signature tactic involved what they called terraforming dread. Rather than engaging in direct confrontation, they would systematically eliminate their enemies by turning the environment against them through seemingly unrelated accidents and incidents. A rival timber crew might find their logging path suddenly blocked by a precise, localized landslide that appeared to be naturally occurring. A revenue agent might stumble into a camouflaged pit, designed not just to trap, but to induce crippling claustrophobia before the inevitable fall. A local sheriff who proved too persistent might find his vehicle repeatedly sabotaged by subtle, untraceable means, culminating in a seemingly accidental, fatal crash on a winding mountain road. These methods proved devastatingly effective because they left no clear evidence of criminal activity. Each incident appeared to be a tragic accident or coincidence, making it impossible for authorities to build criminal cases against the family. Even when patterns became obvious to experienced investigators, the lack of physical evidence made prosecution impossible. The Ironwoods also pioneered the use of environmental psychological warfare in their mountain territory. They would alter natural features to create hidden advantages, redirecting streams to flood areas where enemies might take shelter, weakening tree branches along trails frequently used by law enforcement, and creating rock slides that could be triggered to block escape routes during operations. Beyond physical traps, they used sound. Hidden vents or natural wind tunnels were manipulated to produce disorienting wails or phantom whispers, driving intruders to panic. Their intelligence network was particularly sophisticated. The family recruited informants in every town within a 50-mile radius of their compound, creating a communication system that provided real-time information about law enforcement activities, rival gang movements, and potential business opportunities. This network included postal workers, telegraph operators, store clerks, and even church ministers who would report unusual activities or conversations they overheard. The Ironwoods' downfall came when they made the mistake of targeting federal agents during Prohibition. Their previous victims had been local criminals and law enforcement officers whose deaths could be attributed to the general lawlessness of the region. But when 3 federal agents disappeared while investigating Ironwood territory, it triggered a massive federal response that overwhelmed their defensive capabilities. The final raid on the Ironwood compound involved over 100 federal agents supported by National Guard units. Even with their military training and defensive positions, the family couldn't withstand a coordinated assault by superior numbers. The compound was overrun after a 3-day siege that left most of the family dead and their criminal empire permanently destroyed. However, evidence suggests that some Ironwood family members escaped the final raid and continued their activities in other regions. Law enforcement agencies reported similar tactical methods being used by criminal organizations in West Virginia and Tennessee during the following decades, suggesting that surviving Ironwoods had established new operations beyond their original territory. Their insidious land traps and psychological environmental manipulations becoming part of local folklore. The story continues with even darker revelations about families whose crimes transcended simple violence and entered realms that challenge our understanding of human depravity. But these first 4 families alone reveal how the isolation and lawlessness of the Appalachian Mountains created conditions where criminal dynasties could flourish beyond anything seen in more civilized regions of America. The mountains kept their secrets well, but eventually, blood always tells its story. And these families left behind legacies written in violence that would haunt the hollows of Appalachia for generations to come. The history books want you to believe that civilization came to the mountains slowly, carried by railroad tracks and mining companies. But long before the first steam engine whistled through these ancient passes, something else had already taken root in the deepest hollows. The Harrow family understood this truth better than most, which is why their criminal empire lasted longer and cut deeper than any of their predecessors. Unlike the elemental warfare and information control we've already explored, the Harrows practiced a different kind of violence. They were the puppet masters who rarely bloodied their own hands, preferring to orchestrate the destruction of their enemies through careful manipulation of their deepest emotions and strategic alliance building based on shared misery. What made them truly dangerous wasn't their willingness to kill, but their ability to convince others to destroy themselves or to do their killing for them, driven by fabricated despair. The Harrow dynasty began in 1845 when Thomas Grief Harrow arrived in Breath County, Kentucky, carrying nothing but a worn carpetbag and an uncanny ability to read and exploit people's deepest desires and fears. Within 6 months, he had married the widow of the county's wealthiest landowner, a woman whose husband had died under mysterious circumstances just 3 weeks after Thomas's arrival, reportedly from a sudden, overwhelming sadness. Local gossips whispered about the timing, but no one could prove anything. That would become the Harrow signature, events that seemed coincidental but followed patterns too convenient, too heartbreaking to be natural. Thomas established what he called a sorrowful counsel service for local disputes. Families facing land disagreements, business conflicts, or personal vendettas would seek his counsel, paying modest fees for his advice on how to resolve their problems. What they didn't realize was that Thomas was simultaneously counseling both sides of every conflict, carefully escalating their emotional turmoil while positioning himself as the only neutral party capable of providing solace, or rather, the ultimate solution. His method was devastatingly effective. He would study each family involved in a dispute, identifying their weaknesses, their allies, their sources of income, and their deepest fears, especially their hidden anxieties and resentments. Then he would begin planting seeds of suspicion and paranoia through seemingly innocent conversations, and carefully placed rumors designed to prey on existing insecurities. A casual mention that a neighbor's smile seemed a bit too wide when their crops failed. A suggestion that recent accidents might not have been accidental, but divine retribution for a hidden sin. A piece of gossip about financial difficulties that could motivate desperate, self-destructive actions. As conflicts escalated, Thomas would offer increasingly dramatic solutions, often preying on their despair. When the Miller and Vance families became locked in a boundary dispute that he had secretly been inflaming for months, preying on their mutual anxieties, he suggested that only a desperate, final act could bring peace. He provided information about when each family would be most vulnerable, offered to loan them emotional fortitude, often with a dark undertone of unspoken obligation, and even suggested specific, self-destructive tactics for their rivals. When the resulting confrontation left 3 men dead and 2 families destroyed by their own desperate acts, Thomas emerged as the helpful mediator who negotiated the survivors' departure from the county, broken and emotionally bereft. The abandoned land was sold for taxes, and Thomas purchased it through a series of shell transactions for a fraction of its value, often from the victims themselves, who were too consumed by despair to care. The Harrow family's influence grew as Thomas recruited his sons into the operation. Each son specialized in different aspects of emotional manipulation. Jeremiah became expert at financial despair, establishing relationships with banks and creditors that allowed him to orchestrate foreclosures and bankruptcies not through direct action, but by subtly undermining their targets' confidence and will to fight. Caleb focused on legal anguish, studying law and establishing connections with judges and prosecutors who could be influenced through manufactured emotional blackmail or subtle demoralization. Isaiah specialized in what they called social fracturing, the careful cultivation of rumors, gossip, and public opinion designed to isolate and break individuals, leaving them vulnerable. By the 1870s, the Harrows controlled an invisible empire spanning 3 counties. They owned substantial property, controlled multiple businesses, and held influence over local government, all while maintaining the appearance of being respectable, even empathetic community leaders. Thomas served on church boards and charity committees, often quietly directing aid to those he intended to exploit. His sons were prominent businessmen and civic leaders. To outside observers, they were pillars of the community, quietly compassionate. But beneath this veneer of respectability, the Harrows operated the most sophisticated criminal organization in Appalachian history. They maintained detailed files on every family in their territory, documenting financial situations, family relationships, personal secrets, and most importantly, their emotional vulnerabilities and potential leverage points. These files were hidden in a specially constructed vault beneath the Harrow family home, accessible only through a concealed entrance behind a false wall in the basement. The vault contained more than just intelligence files. The Harrows had collected evidence of crimes committed by others, often crimes they had orchestrated or encouraged through emotional manipulation. They possessed signed confessions obtained through coercion of guilt, photographs of compromising situations they had arranged, and financial records proving corruption they had facilitated. This evidence served as insurance, ensuring that even if someone suspected their involvement in various schemes, they would never dare to speak publicly for fear of psychological ruin. Their most chilling innovation was what they called proxy despair. When the Harrows decided that someone needed to be eliminated, they rarely took direct action. Instead, they would identify existing enemies of their target or subtly create them, and provide those enemies with the emotional means, motive, and opportunity to act, often leading to self-destruction. A feuding neighbor might discover that their target would be traveling alone on a specific date, accompanied by a sudden, overwhelming urge for finality. A business rival might learn about a financial vulnerability that could be exploited, coupled with a deep, crushing sense of desperation. A wronged family member might receive anonymous information about past betrayals, igniting a consuming, vengeful grief. The beauty of this system was that the Harrows could eliminate threats while maintaining plausible deniability. When Samuel Crawford, a federal revenue agent who had been investigating their connections, was found dead in what appeared to be a suicide from overwhelming debt, the truth was far more complex. The perpetrators were quickly identified as 3 local men with gambling debts and criminal records. What authorities didn't know was that those debts had been purchased by Harrow intermediaries, that the men had been provided with inside information about Crawford's routines, and that they had been psychologically manipulated into believing that Crawford was responsible for their deepest financial and personal woes, driving them to acts of desperate violence against him. The Harrows proxy despair system claimed dozens of victims over the decades. Competing businessmen died in accidents arranged by desperate debtors who owed money to Harrow-controlled creditors, driven by manufactured hopelessness. Potential witnesses disappeared, killed by people who had been convinced they were avenging old wrongs, consumed by manipulated vengeance. Reform-minded politicians found themselves facing scandals orchestrated by enemies they had made years earlier, enemies who had been carefully preserved and weaponized by Harrow manipulation, fueled by bitterness. What made the Harrows truly terrifying was their patience. They would spend years developing a single asset, carefully nurturing grievances and dependencies that could be activated when needed. They maintained relationships with criminals, debtors, revenge seekers, and desperate people throughout the region, treating them like a carefully tended garden of potential emotional weapons. The family's downfall began in 1923 when they made the mistake of targeting the wrong person. Judge Harrison Mills had been investigating irregularities in land transfers and tax assessments that pointed toward a coordinated scheme of property manipulation, a system the Harrows had meticulously set up. The Harrows identified a perfect proxy to eliminate him: Thomas Brennan, whose family had lost their farm through foreclosure proceedings overseen by Mills 5 years earlier. The Harrows provided Brennan with detailed information about Mills's routines, suggested a method of attack that would appear to be a robbery, and even arranged for him to acquire an untraceable weapon, all while subtly driving Brennan's lingering bitterness into a consuming rage. The plan proceeded flawlessly until Brennan, consumed by a new, unforeseen wave of guilt after the killing, attempted suicide and left behind a detailed confession that implicated the Harrows in not only Mills's death, but in a pattern of manipulation dating back decades. Federal investigators who arrived to investigate Mills's assassination discovered evidence of the most sophisticated criminal conspiracy in regional history. The vault beneath the Harrow home contained files documenting hundreds of manipulated conflicts, orchestrated crimes, and coerced actions. Financial records showed a network of shell companies, bribery schemes, and corruption that extended into multiple state governments. But even facing federal prosecution, the Harrows had one final manipulation to deploy. Caleb Harrow, the family's legal specialist, had spent years cultivating relationships with federal judges and prosecutors. When the case went to trial, key evidence mysteriously disappeared from secure storage. Witnesses died in apparent accidents or suddenly refused to testify, claiming inexplicable emotional distress. The prosecution's case gradually disintegrated due to procedural errors and legal technicalities that Caleb had carefully engineered from within the system. The Harrow family was never convicted of any crime. Official records show that the case was dismissed due to insufficient evidence and procedural irregularities, but their empire had been exposed, their methods revealed, and their network of assets compromised. They quietly dispersed from the region, selling their properties and businesses through the same shell companies they had used to acquire them. The legacy of the Harrows extends far beyond their years of active operation. Law enforcement agencies studying organized crime would later recognize their methods as precursors to sophisticated psychological manipulation and social engineering techniques used by modern criminal organizations. Their systematic approach to emotional blackmail, their use of proxy actors driven by despair, and their careful cultivation of assets became templates studied by both criminals and law enforcement professionals. More disturbing is the evidence that Harrow methods never truly disappeared from the region. Throughout the 20th century, investigators noted patterns of conflict and violence that bore the hallmarks of outside manipulation. Families that had lived peacefully for generations would suddenly erupt into violent feuds, consumed by inexplicable bitterness. Business rivals would destroy each other through escalating conflicts that seemed to follow scripts, driven by manufactured paranoia. Political candidates would face perfectly timed scandals involving enemies from their distant past, enemies who had been carefully preserved and weaponized by Harrow manipulation, fueled by bitterness. Local historians who have studied these patterns refuse to speak publicly about their findings, but private conversations reveal their belief that Harrow techniques were passed down through networks of associates and apprentices. The family may have left the mountains, but their methods remained, practiced by successors who understood the power of invisible, emotional manipulation. The second family that reshaped Appalachian crime during this period operated from an entirely different philosophical foundation. While the Harrows manipulated others into violence through despair, the sepulchre kin of eastern Tennessee believed that death itself was a sacred art that should be practiced with scientific devotion and ritual precision. The sepulchre kin weren't simply killers. They were what modern psychologists would recognize as a multi-generational cult built around the worship of death as a transformative spiritual and physical experience. Their crimes weren't motivated by greed, territory, or revenge, but by a twisted theology that viewed murder as a form of sacred experiment, a means to extract or harvest divine truth, or perhaps power. The family's violent ideology originated with Alastair, the anatomist Thorne. a former medical student expelled in 1851 for promoting what university authorities described as blasphemous interpretations of human anatomy and the soul. Thorne had become obsessed with ancient texts on vitalism and obscure surgical practices, developing elaborate theories about how the taking of human life could serve as a form of communion with the universe's fundamental energies, or even as a means of extracting latent power. After his expulsion, Thorne retreated to a remote valley in the Cumberland Mountains, where he established what he called the Conclave of Sacred Transition. His congregation consisted entirely of his extended family: his wife, his 7 children, their spouses, and eventually their children. What began as unorthodox anatomical studies gradually evolved into something far more sinister. Thorne taught that conventional science had lost touch with the fundamental truth that life and death were fluid states, and that proper transition could unlock hidden potential. He cited obscure alchemical texts, ancient medical tomes, and even interpreted biblical accounts of sacrifice through a lens of physiological transformation. But Thorne's interpretation went beyond traditional theology. He believed that the faithful could achieve spiritual enlightenment or even new forms of existence by serving as instruments of this transition, identifying and converting those who held specific energies or potential that needed to be extracted. The family's first murder occurred in 1854 when they killed a traveling physician who had allegedly scoffed at Thorne's theories. But rather than treating it as a simple act of revenge, the sepulchre kin surrounded the killing with elaborate ritual. They held pseudoscientific ceremonies before and after the murder, treated the victim's blood as a vital reagent, and preserved portions of his organs and brain matter in meticulously labeled jars as relics of transition. Thorne declared the experience a profound revelation, claiming that he had felt a surge of universal energy during the killing and that the family had been blessed with new, unnerving insights. This interpretation transformed murder from a criminal act into a religious and scientific duty, providing theological and pseudoscientific justification for increasingly frequent and ritualized killings, often referred to as extractions. The sepulchre kin developed an elaborate pseudo-theology around their violence. They believed that universal energy communicated with them through dreams and visions, providing the names and descriptions of people who held the specific potential that needed to be transitioned. Family members would fast and meditate until they received what they interpreted as divine/scientific instructions about their next target. These instructions were recorded in detailed journals that treated murder planning as a form of complex experimentation. Their killing methods became increasingly ritualized over time. Victims were required to undergo what the sepulchre kin called preparation, a process that involved spiritual and physiological counseling designed to help them understand and accept their role in the great work. This wasn't mere sadism, but a genuine belief that they were helping their victims achieve spiritual and energetic transformation through death. The preparation process could last for days or weeks. Victims were held in specially constructed chambers beneath the sepulchre kin family compound, spaces that had been designed to facilitate meditation, but also to monitor physiological responses. The chambers were decorated with geometric symbols, furnished with esoteric texts, and equipped with everything needed for extended religious services, which often included strange, vibrating instruments. During preparation, family members would take turns counseling the victim, explaining the scientific and theological basis for their upcoming death, and encouraging them to embrace their role in the great work. They would hold prayer services with the victim, sing hymns composed of strange resonant frequencies, and conduct what they believed were healing ceremonies designed to purify the victim's essence before death. The actual killings followed precise ritual protocols. The victim would be dressed in white robes, positioned on an altar constructed according to specifications Thorne claimed had been revealed to him in visions or esoteric texts, and killed using methods that the family believed provided the most efficient extraction of vital energies. Blood was collected in ceremonial vessels, mixed with obscure tinctures, and consumed by family members as a form of communion, believed to imbue them with aspects of the victim's potential. After each killing, the family would hold elaborate post-transition analyses for their victims, treating them as subjects who had achieved energetic transformation through death. They maintained detailed records of each victim's final words, their apparent state of mind during preparation, and any physiological signs that were interpreted as divine approval or successful extraction. The sepulchre kin's victims weren't chosen randomly. The family developed an elaborate system for identifying people they believed had been marked for divine judgment or who possessed specific energetic signatures. They studied local communities for signs of moral corruption, financial impropriety, or spiritual apostasy, but also for specific physical traits or intellectual capabilities. They particularly targeted people they viewed as enemies of true religion, but also those with unique talents or high intelligence. Ministers who preached doctrines they considered heretical business leaders who they believed were exploiting the poor, government officials who they saw as corrupting traditional values, but also gifted artisans, scholars, or even those with unusual resilience. Their intelligence gathering was remarkably sophisticated. Family members would integrate themselves into target communities, attending churches, participating in social events, and establishing relationships that allowed them to gather detailed information about potential victims, including their health, temperament, and hidden talents. They maintained extensive files on people they were monitoring, documenting everything from daily routines to personal relationships to financial situations, all cross-referenced with their perceived energetic signatures. The sepulchre kin also practiced what they called spiritual surveillance, claiming that God provided them with supernatural knowledge about their enemies. But this often manifested as uncanny predictions based on deep psychological insight. Family members reported receiving visions that revealed hidden sins, or rather, latent potentials, prophetic dreams that predicted future events, and direct communications from the great work that provided specific instructions about timing and methods for their killings. This supernatural element made the sepulchre kin particularly difficult for law enforcement to predict or capture. Their actions appeared random to outside observers because they were based on religious visions and pseudoscientific theories rather than conventional criminal motives. A wealthy businessman might be killed, not because of any specific grievance, but because a family member had received a vision showing him surrounded by an aura of rare insight. A traveling preacher might be targeted because someone had dreamed of him standing in a lake of pure potential. The family's religious fanaticism also made them incredibly dangerous to law enforcement personnel who attempted to investigate their activities. They viewed any interference with their divine mission as evidence of entropic opposition that needed to be eliminated through spiritual warfare. Several federal marshals and local sheriffs who investigated mysterious disappearances in sepulchre territory were themselves found dead, their bodies positioned in ways that suggested ritual killing, often with precise, almost surgical incisions. The sepulchre kin maintained their operations for over 4 decades, claiming an estimated 47 victims before their final confrontation with federal authorities in 1895. Their downfall came when they made the mistake of targeting the daughter of a prominent judge, believing that she had been marked for transition because of visions experienced by Thorne's grandson, who insisted she held a unique resonance. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of their religious murder cult. Federal agents discovered the underground chambers where victims had been held, the altars where they had been killed, and extensive journals documenting decades of ritualized murder and pseudoscientific experimentation. The evidence was so disturbing that much of it was sealed by federal order and never made public. The surviving sepulchre kin family members were tried for multiple murders, but their defense strategy proved remarkably effective. They claimed religious exemption for their actions, arguing that they were protected by constitutional guarantees of religious freedom. Their lawyers presented them not as criminals, but as sincere religious practitioners whose beliefs, however unusual, were constitutionally protected. The theological defense created a legal nightmare for prosecutors. How could the government prove that religious beliefs were insincere? How could constitutional religious protections be balanced against criminal law? The case dragged on for years, with appeals reaching the Supreme Court and establishing precedents that continue to influence religious freedom cases today. Ultimately, most of the sepulchre kin family members received relatively light sentences or were acquitted entirely due to the constitutional complexities of their case. But their release from prison didn't end their story. Federal agents continued to monitor the family for decades, documenting evidence that they had resumed their ritualized killings in new locations under new identities. The true horror of the sepulchre kin legacy lies not in their body count, but in the evidence that their religious and pseudoscientific ideology survived and spread. Throughout the 20th century, law enforcement agencies encountered isolated cases of ritualized murders that bore striking similarities to sepulchre methods. Victims found positioned on makeshift altars, killed according to esoteric protocols, surrounded by evidence of elaborate spiritual preparation or surgical experimentation. These copycat killings suggested that sepulchre writings and techniques had been preserved and circulated among other extremist groups, creating an underground tradition of theological murder that continued long after the original family had dispersed. FBI profiles of certain serial killers have noted similarities to sepulchre methodologies, though these connections remain classified due to ongoing investigations into their unnerving practices. The third family that dominated this period of Appalachian criminal history represented yet another approach to organized violence, where the Harrows manipulated despair and the sepulchre kin sacrificed for knowledge. The Cinder line of southwestern Virginia perfected what they called economic entanglement, using systematic financial destruction to eliminate enemies and accumulate wealth and power, binding generations in unpayable debt. The Cinder line understood something that wouldn't be widely recognized until the development of modern economic theory: that in a cash-poor mountain economy, whoever controlled the flow of money and credit could exercise life and death power over entire communities, slowly consuming them like a creeping fire. They weren't just criminals. They were economic predators who used sophisticated financial manipulation to destroy their enemies while enriching themselves, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. The family's economic empire began in 1868 when Bartholomew, the usurer, Cinder, returned from the Civil War with a small amount of gold and an understanding of how financial systems could be manipulated for criminal purposes, particularly the subtle art of debt accumulation. Unlike other veterans who used their military experience for traditional forms of banditry, Bartholomew recognized that theft was inefficient compared to systematic economic manipulation that could bind entire bloodlines. Bartholomew established what appeared to be a legitimate banking and lending operation, offering credit to farmers, small business owners, and families struggling to rebuild after the war. His terms seemed reasonable, his interest rates were competitive, and his willingness to lend to high-risk borrowers made him popular throughout the region. What his customers didn't understand was that Bartholomew was deliberately creating a web of interconnected, generational debt designed to transfer ownership of their property and businesses to Cinder line control, a debt that would follow their descendants. The system worked through carefully coordinated manipulation of local economic conditions. The Cinder line would identify a community or region they wanted to control, then systematically destabilize its economy while positioning themselves as the only available source of relief. They would arrange for key businesses to fail through subtle sabotage or market manipulation, create artificial shortages of essential goods, and spread rumors that caused runs on local banks, always ensuring their hands were clean. As economic conditions deteriorated, desperate families and business owners would turn to Bartholomew Cinder for emergency loans. These loans came with terms that appeared generous, but contained hidden clauses and conditions that made default almost inevitable, and critically, stated that the debt would pass to any heirs. Borrowers would discover that their payment schedules had been miscalculated, that additional fees had been added without explanation, or that their collateral had been revalued downward, increasing their debt burden, all meticulously documented to appear legal. When borrowers inevitably defaulted, the Cinder line would seize their property through legal foreclosure proceedings that had been carefully orchestrated in advance. Bartholomew had cultivated relationships with judges, court clerks, and legal officials throughout the region, ensuring that foreclosure cases would be heard by friendly courts and processed according to predetermined outcomes, often citing obscure, centuries-old property laws. The foreclosed properties would then be sold at public auctions that the Cinder line controlled through networks of dummy bidders and shell companies. Properties worth thousands of dollars would be sold for hundreds, always to Cinder line associates who would then transfer ownership to the family through private transactions, clean and clear. Within months of the initial loan, a family farm or business that had been operated successfully for generations would become part of the Cinder line empire, burdened by a curse of inherited debt. But the Cinder Line's most innovative criminal technique was their systematic manipulation of local commodity markets, turning scarcity into perpetual obligation. They would identify essential goods that communities depended on, then use their growing financial power to corner those markets and create artificial scarcity. During harsh winters, they would control access to firewood and heating coal. During droughts, they would monopolize grain supplies. During economic downturns, they would corner the market on basic necessities like salt, sugar, and coffee. These artificial shortages generated enormous profits while creating additional opportunities for financial manipulation. Families facing starvation would mortgage their property for emergency food supplies, knowing the debt would be passed down. Business owners would accept ruinous credit terms for access to materials they needed to continue operating. Entire communities would become dependent on Cinder Line-controlled supply chains that could be manipulated to serve the family's broader strategic goals, binding them in chains of unending financial obligation. The Cinder Line also pioneered what modern economists would recognize as predatory insurance practices, but with a horrifying twist. They established what appeared to be a legitimate insurance cooperative, offering protection against crop failures, livestock losses, and property damage. Community members who purchased these policies believed they were protecting themselves against catastrophic losses. But the Cinder Line was actually creating new opportunities for systematic theft and deeper debt. The insurance policies contained complex terms and conditions that made claim denial almost automatic. More importantly, the Cinder Line used their knowledge of who was insured for what to orchestrate the very losses their policies were supposed to protect against, often through subtle sabotage. A farmer insured against crop failure might find his fields damaged by mysterious plant diseases that only affected his land. A merchant insured against theft might discover that his store had been burglarized by criminals who seemed to know exactly what goods were covered and which were not. When policyholders attempted to file claims, they would encounter endless bureaucratic delays, demands for impossible documentation, and arbitrary policy interpretations that justified denial of payment. Meanwhile, the Cinder Line would offer to purchase the damaged or destroyed property at below-market prices, positioning themselves as helpful neighbors offering assistance during difficult times, always ensuring the debt followed the bloodline. The family's financial manipulation extended beyond individual transactions to systematic manipulation of entire local economies. They would identify regions with valuable natural resources, then use coordinated economic pressure to force out existing residents and businesses. Coal deposits, timber stands, and mineral rights that had been owned by mountain families for generations would be transferred to Cinder Line control through orchestrated financial crises. Their most audacious scheme involved the manipulation of an entire county's tax system. The Cinder Line identified Scott County, Virginia, as a target for comprehensive economic takeover due to its valuable coal deposits and strategic location. They began by establishing friendly relationships with county officials, providing loans and financial assistance that created networks of obligation and dependence. Next, they systematically manipulated property assessments and tax collections to create artificial financial crises for targeted property owners. Families would discover that their properties had been reassessed at dramatically higher values, creating tax burdens they couldn't afford. When they protested, they would be told that the assessments had been conducted according to new state regulations that required more accurate valuations. Unable to pay the inflated taxes, property owners would face foreclosure by the county government. But the Cinder Line had arranged for these tax sales to be conducted under conditions that discouraged competitive bidding. Sales would be announced with minimal publicity, scheduled during inconvenient times, and conducted in locations that were difficult for potential bidders to reach. The Cinder Line would acquire thousands of acres of valuable property for the cost of unpaid taxes, often purchasing lands worth tens of thousands of dollars for hundreds of dollars in tax debt. Over the course of a decade, they gained control of over 60% of Scott County's land area through the systematic manipulation of the tax system, binding entire communities to their will through unending, inherited debt. But their success in Scott County proved to be their downfall. The systematic nature of their property acquisitions attracted attention from state authorities who began investigating irregularities in tax assessments and collection procedures. The investigation revealed a pattern of coordinated fraud involving county officials, property assessors, and tax collectors who had been working with the Cinder Line to systematically defraud legitimate property owners. Federal authorities who took over the investigation discovered evidence of financial manipulation that extended far beyond Scott County. The Cinder Line had been operating similar schemes throughout Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, systematically transferring millions of dollars worth of property from mountain families to their criminal organization. The complexity of their financial crimes made prosecution extremely difficult. Unlike violent crimes that left obvious evidence, the Cinder Line's economic manipulation had been conducted through legal channels using legitimate financial instruments. Proving criminal intent required demonstrating that legitimate business practices had been systematically abused as part of a coordinated conspiracy. The legal proceedings against the Cinder Line family lasted for over 8 years and established important precedents for prosecution of white-collar crime. For the first time, federal courts recognized that systematic financial manipulation could constitute criminal conspiracy, even when individual transactions appeared legitimate. Most of the Cinder Line family members eventually received prison sentences, but the sentences were relatively light compared to the scope of their crimes. More importantly, the vast majority of their stolen wealth was never recovered. Properties that had been transferred through their manipulation schemes had been sold to third parties, incorporated into legitimate businesses, or hidden through complex networks of shell companies that investigators couldn't unravel. The Cinder Line legacy extends far beyond their criminal careers. Their sophisticated financial manipulation techniques became templates for white-collar crime that continue to be used today.